This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
The weekly wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Claire Kimball.
And I'm Andrew Williams.
Andrew, thanks for stepping in again this week.
It's a pleasure.
It's a big, meaty news lineup, so very good that you're here. We're starting with the riots in LA over the Trump administration's crackdown on illegal immigrants.
And we'll also get you across how PM Anthony Albanese is planning to spend the next 3 years and another stuff up at Monash IVF.
Yep, we're talking about cancelled shows as well, but we're starting with a song. Our podcast today is brought to you by HubSpot. We all need a bit more breathing room in our workdays, and HubSpot gives it to you. Breeze, their built-in AI, takes care of the busy work so you can focus on growth. Andrew, what's your favourite Beach Boys song?
This is a bit of an obvious choice, but it's my favourite. God Only Knows is just an astonishing piece of music.
I reckon for you because it's got such an overlay into movies.
Yes, it's used in movies. It was used as the theme song, I think, for the TV show Big Love, if anyone remembers that TV show from back in the day.
I remember that show.
Yeah, so it's had a lot of use and it's just a beautiful track.
It is a beautiful track. Of course, we're talking about this because Brian Wilson, who was the co-founder and really the driving creative force behind the Beach Boys, he died this week. Long-time squizzers know that I'm a really big Beatles fan. And when you go down a rabbit hole of music from that sort of era, so we're talking about the mid-60s, it's impossible not to bump into Wilson and the Beach Boys because they were real innovators.
Yeah, people talk about Sgt. Pepper's from the Beatles being a landmark moment in music. They had a few over the journey, but you can definitely put the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds in that same conversation. It belongs in that ranking.
Yeah, that album, God Only Knows, was from that. Also songs like Wouldn't It Be Nice? Wilson used techniques in that album that were groundbreaking.
Yes, as we learned while reading about him though, and as people that know about his life would know, he also did use quite a lot of drugs over the course of his life.
A lot of drugs. Yeah. And look, you only have to look at the album cover of Pet Sounds to see that. It's the band feeding goats.
Yes, another thing that he has in common with the Beatles, I suppose.
That's true.
Yeah.
Like feeding goats or using drugs?
Using drugs.
Yeah.
I'm sure they fed a goat at some stage. They lived long and interesting lives.
True. Look, anyway, that's my recommendation for this week. We're getting that out early. Dial up Pet Sounds at some point this weekend and have a listen.
Absolutely. So that leaves me to search for a segue to our first major news story of the week, and I'm going to go with this. So the mid-60s, when the Beach Boys were at their height, was also the last time an American president called in the National Guard against the wishes of the state where they were sent. How's that? Is that good?
It's a long strand, but I'm going to roll with it.
I'll go with it.
And yes, look, it's been the biggest news story this week, of course, US President Donald Trump's response to protests in Los Angeles after raids were carried out last week by federal agents. It became a bit of a flashpoint for days of protests in America's second largest city.
Yeah, there were both peaceful marches and violent clashes with law enforcement, and that prompted the president to call in the military. So Trump deployed the National Guard and Marines over the objections of local and state leaders there.
I guess the first question, certainly I had anyway, is who were the National Guard and what the parameters are for their use. I've found that there's been a lot of assumed knowledge in the reporting of this story this week.
Yeah, because it's not really something that we have in our structure in Australia. I know the National Guard because I watch a lot of American political television shows and they come up quite a lot, but many people wouldn't. So to answer that question, it's basically a hybrid branch of the US armed services that serves both state and federal interests. So often it operates under state command and control using state funding. Sometimes National Guard troops will be assigned by their state to serve a federal mission or a federal objective. And usually those deployments are carried out with the agreement of the governor of that state.
The idea, though, is that they're not used in civilian law enforcement duties against US citizens, except in times of emergency. And that's why it's been such a big deal this week.
It has. And in order to make that lawful, Trump had to put part of California's National Guard under what is known as Title 10 authority. So that places him, not the governor of California, atop the chain of command.
Yeah, so just in terms of numbers, 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines who are straight up and down US military troops. They were deployed to Los Angeles. California Governor is Gavin Newsom. He called the president's actions a serious breach of state sovereignty.
And speaking of the governor, there's a political context here. There's political importance to this because Gavin Newsom is a significant figure for the Democratic Party. He's been talked about a lot as a future leader and a possible presidential candidate. And the Democrats, of course, are the party that Trump beat at the election. And he's very much tipped to be the guy who's going to maybe lead the charge at the next election for the Democrats.
Yeah, he's certainly one of those figures that is very much at the top of the Democratic tree at the moment. Commentators really are pointing to a lot of politics at play at the moment. Trump, though, is adamant that these protests were heading out of control and that there was action needed. He says that without the military and his intervention, Los Angeles, and this is his quote, would be a crime scene like we haven't seen in years. Some context about the scale of these protests, I guess, is quite helpful too.
Yeah, and LA is not a stranger as a city to protests and riots that are stoked by racial issues. In 1991, a man named Rodney King led police on a high-speed chase before police officers caught up with him. He was a black man and police were filmed taking turns to kick and beat him.
Yeah, and that wasn't the thing that actually set off the protests or riots.
Yeah.
What happened was a year later, those officers went to trial. A jury acquitted them of using excess force and things really blew up.
Yeah, exactly right. So in 1992, when that happened, after nearly a week of rioting, more than 50 people had lost their lives in those riots and more than 2,000 people had sustained injuries. Thousands of people were arrested and the total bill for property damage exceeded $1 billion.
It's one of those news stories that I have very firmly in my head. I absolutely remember that time. I was probably at the end of high school. It was one of those big news stories from my childhood, I guess.
Yeah.
We get then to 2020 and George Floyd. He was killed by a police officer in Minnesota. There were protests nationwide, including in LA. Many of those protests were quite violent. There's been quite a bit said this week about how top Democrats at that time actually joined demonstrations calling for the cutting of police budgets. President Trump, as a Republican, could not be handling this episode more differently.
No, the rhetoric is extremely different. So one of the first things he said last weekend when these protests broke out and there were reports that police were being spat at, so he posted on social media that if they spit, we will hit. Such disrespect will not be tolerated, ! He was very clear about it.
Yeah, so the shorthand, I guess, there is Trump is saying to Americans, the Democrats are soft on law and order. I'll take whatever steps are necessary to maintain order across the country. To wrap this up, I guess we should cover off the issue that really kicked all of this off. So the efforts of immigration and customs enforcement officers to arrest people over alleged immigration violations.
Yeah, you've probably heard ICE thrown around in headlines and stories a fair bit this week. That's what it refers to, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's the law enforcement agency under the Department of Homeland Security. And at the election, Trump promised the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants.
It was a really big election promise
Yep.
of his. That agency has been tasked with making a minimum 3,000 arrests a day. Those efforts were really on display last week. Deporting undocumented immigrants isn't something new, though, and it's not something specific to the Trump administration. So to put some numbers around this, since the start of this year, so since pretty much Trump came into the White House again, around 200,000 people have been deported from the United States for those immigration violations. For comparison, during the Biden administration last year, 2024, they deported over 700,000 people.
And to give you a sense of the scale of the issue at large, authorities reckon there are about 11 million people living in the US as unauthorised immigrants. That's of a population of about 340 million, and the majority of those are from Mexico. So I did a bit of poking around to see what estimates there are on the number of people living here illegally in Australia. That's 70,000. So most of those have arrived on student or visitor visas, and even when you compare those numbers to our respective populations, it's still a much bigger percentage in the US.
Yeah, much bigger, and a very different situation, of course. Being an island certainly has advantages when it comes to enforcement. And I guess to point out too, in the past, Trump has actually held up Australia as a bit of a poster child for our tough border policies and a place that America can learn from.
Yep. And as for the protests themselves, they are ongoing. They've spread to other cities as well. There are protests right across the country now on the same issue. And downtown LA has been placed under a curfew overnight to try and get the protesters to go home.
A message now from HubSpot. Growing a business takes so much time and energy. That's what makes HubSpot so valuable for marketing, sales, and service teams. Breeze, their built-in AI, handles all those tasks that eat up your day. From following up with leads to creating content. Customers are cutting sales cycles in half and getting hours back each week. Check out hubspot.com/AI to learn more. Andrew, as we're recording this on Friday, there's a couple of big late-breaking stories to mention. The scale of the plane crash in India is starting to become more clear. Air India says that 241 people have lost their lives. One passenger, a British national, survived. Apparently walked clear of the crash.
Yeah, there's video of it, of him walking clear. It's quite astonishing.
Extraordinary. We won't go into that any further because there's not a lot more to say at this point. It's clearly a tragedy. We also wanted to mention Israel has launched an unprecedented attack on Iran. They've targeted Iran's nuclear assets and also its senior military leaders. As we're recording this, reports are just starting to come through, but it's going to reignite this whole conversation about the risk of a wider regional war in the Middle East. So let's just park those. No doubt they'll be a big feature of next week. So we're going to pick up the three other stories for the week, starting with a very big speech this week.
Yes, we've spent a lot of time over the last few weeks, really, talking about the coalition's woes after their shocker of an election result back in early May, but not a lot of time comparatively focusing on what the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, plans to do with his very big win. I don't think it's just us who's guilty of that. It can be hard to look away from a problem like the coalition's having.
Shocker is one way of putting the coalition's result. That's right.
It wasn't great. But Albanese did pop up this week to kind of try and steer the ship back towards what the government is going to do. And he did that at the National Press Club with an address.
He did. He said, and this is his sort of big quote, I guess, setting the scene. Before the election, my colleagues and I were clear about our commitments and our approach, and the democratic verdict rendered by Australians was every bit as clear. He said that the result, undeniable. It's a bit, I guess, less clear, about what the government's focus really is in the coming term. A lot of rhetoric in this speech as well.
Yeah, so some of that rhetoric included Albanese saying that to build on the foundations we had laid, to carry forward the reforms we had begun, and to drive an economy that nourishes their aspiration and repays their efforts, and a society where everyone has the opportunity to fulfil their potential. That is rhetoric, as he is entitled to do, but not a lot of specifics
not a
in
lot
that
of
bit.
Details. But he did lay out some specifics, to be fair. Of course, he went to the election campaign and Labor did, promising to bolster Medicare. There's going to be a drop in the price of PBS-listed medicines, investments in education, also tax cuts for lower income earners. Probably the big bit of new news, though, coming out of this was a focus on productivity. Yeah,
this piqued my interest when I read about this speech. So Treasurer Jim Chalmers has been tasked with bringing together a group of business leaders, the union movement and other stakeholders in August to come up with tangible actions to drive economic growth. So he says it's about Australians earning more and keeping more of what they earn.
So what the experts say about this is it's about creating sort of consensus for a new economic agenda, and that would include things like tax reform, deregulation, and also streamlining processes. By the way, a lot of those processes lay with the state governments, but processes around major projects and getting them off the ground. It won't touch industrial relations, though. That's a really big thing for business. It's not going in that direction. But at a time, I guess, when both Labor and the Coalition have been really criticised for not really having much on the reform agenda, it's been cautiously welcomed.
Yeah, I saw a couple of people calling our most recent election sort of the Seinfeld election and that it was about nothing. Whether you agree with that or not, don't know. But Albanese did talk about Australians voting to strengthen our defence capability and strengthen our relationships in the region. And then, funnily enough, a day later, US officials announced a review of AUKUS.
Timing is just
Everything.
something sometimes, isn't it? Yeah. And I guess when it comes to agenda items of this term of government, it really doesn't come much bigger than defence. Andrew Tillett is the Financial Review's defence correspondent, and he wrote about it this week. He said, by hook or by crook, Donald Trump will make the Albanese government splurge even more on defence. Where that money comes from, how it's deployed, and how we then manage this strategic relationship with the United States and the Trump administration, it's going to require a lot of attention.
It's a lot of attention, and it'll be something to watch in the weeks and months to come for sure. Moving on to another big topic this week. This was the story, as we mentioned at the top, around Monash IVF, which is a major fertility company in Australia, and it announced that it had discovered a second occasion where it had implanted the wrong embryo into a patient. So when I first saw this story alert pop up, I was in the office and I turned around to the rest of the office and I said, the Monash thing has happened again, and everyone knew exactly what I was talking about.
It's funny how these things sort of come up, doesn't it? And you sort of have a shared understanding of what that is, because when it happened the first time, it was such a big story. So let's, I guess, dig into what actually happened, because it's a little bit complicated.
Yeah, it is,
on Tuesday, Monash announced that they'd mistakenly implanted an embryo into a patient rather than implanting the embryo into one member of a same-sex couple who was using IVF to conceive. They implanted the person's same embryo back into them, which they described as contrary to the treatment plan.
Yeah, it was supposed to be their partner's embryo, not theirs. And that comes a couple of months after they revealed this initial mix-up that kicked this whole story off, which happened back in Brisbane in 2023. That time, the mother was implanted with the wrong embryo from an entirely different patient and actually ended up giving birth to that child, which has no genetic link to her.
Do we know whatever happened with that?
We do not. It's surprising in many ways how unclear it still is.
Because there were
exactly
lots of questions about what legal redress or what might actually happen with that child. Anyway, parking that, just thought it was worth the question.
There's quite a lot of privacy issues around this, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Yeah. And look, in the world of business, of course, one mistake might be something a company like Monash could get past, but it seems like a second one points to something a bit more systemic and really difficult for them at that corporate level to explain, especially because they're a publicly listed company. They're on the Australian Stock Exchange.
Yeah, they are, and their share price is down 50% to where it was at the start of the year, and that may have been a factor. If you read corporate experts, it was a factor in what happened late in the week, because the company's CEO, Mike Knapp, announced that he was resigning his position as a result. He's been there since 2019, and after he announced his resignation, the stock price did tick up a bit after that decision, so the investors were clearly looking at that, but it's going to be a long way back for the company to get clear of this whole issue, a long way.
There's the company part, but there's also a question about regulation. I've been quite interested to see this week more commentary about how unregulated a lot of this stuff is. There's a meeting of our federal, state and territory health ministers happening on Friday as we're recording. There's questions about whether there might be at least the start of a process around looking at regulation in that space. So we'll have to see what comes of that meeting.
Yeah, often when we follow a news story, when we're reporting it on Squiz Today, there are things that we didn't know or that surprise us. Happens all the time. And one of those things was that embryologists don't have to be registered in Australia like other doctors and nurses. So that will no doubt be one thing that's hot on the agenda. And then, of course, there's people who are currently going through an IVF process or considering an IVF process or have gone through an IVF process. So this story has probably a really emotional effect on them as well. And there was a radio host in Melbourne, Jace Hawkins, and he said when he learned of the second incident, he had a child with his partner using IVF, their youngest, and he said that hearing these stories hit him really hard. He described it as an icky feeling when he heard about it.
Yeah, you can totally understand that. Moving on to our final story of the three, and lots of changes in news media this week.
Yeah, just for something different for the news media, a lot of changes, a lot of upheaval, which is a great media word. You know I love a trivia question.
You do.
So I've got one
You
for
are
you.
a trivia king.
I am. Well, I don't know about that, but I do enjoy it. Which started first, Q&A on the ABC or the Project on Channel 10?
Now, you've actually written the answer here for me, and I deliberately haven't looked at it so that I could play it out. And look, I can only sort of tabulate it back to my time as a press secretary, so dealing with politicians who were being pitched by these shows to come on. I reckon, because the project was sort of on that Rove wave, which is very Kevin 07.
Yes.
So I'm going to say the project was first in sort of 2007 and then Q&A a little bit after that.
You've got Q&A dead on the money, 2008, but the project actually started in 2009.
Yeah,
so
right.
it sort of followed, kind of as you said, in the wake of the Rove show.
I should have snuck.
You should have just looked at the answer. But it is very close. It is very, very close between the two. And they've both gone through a lot of changes in that time. As you can imagine, the project started out as the 7 p.m. project when it first started before losing the 7 p.m. And Q&A lost the ampersand and just became Q+A, as I like to call it. Which never made any sense to me at all. But weirdly enough, they've both been axed in the same week after starting very close together as well.
Yeah, rough week for broadcast TV. They've both done well. A lot of people are talking about to be around for so long, really, because it has been quite a bit of time. And neither of the formats really sort of updated after they launched. They were quite cutting edge when they launched, but they never really sort of iterated after that. Of course, when it comes to audiences, we've changed a lot in that time as well. Q&A was really sort of styled as something quite new.
Yeah.
And it was really one of those only forums where a group of people would come together to debate big issues and an audience was present to actually throw in their questions as well. And I know certainly from the ABC perspective, that was one of the reasons they were saying for so long they wanted to keep it. It was one of those really rare forums. Some really big moments over the years too on Q&A.
Yeah, I remember there was the time.
Q+A.
Q+A. It was Q&A when this happened. When someone, when an activist threw his shoes at John Howard. I don't know if you remember that one.
I
I'm sure you do. The ABC had to apologise for that happening because obviously, apart from being compelling television in a way, it was obviously a big issue. That was in the Tony Jones years. Of course, it became sort of a running joke that whenever Malcolm Turnbull was on the show, he would wear his leather bomber jacket.
Oh, yeah.
That was sort of like his Q&A uniform. I used to imagine him having a little cupboard that just had Q&A on it and it was just full of bomber jackets.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he would just go, I'm on Q&A today.
You thought about that way too much.
I think about everything way too much. And then there was also, I guess, the way that it integrated with Twitter in its early years. That was a really big thing about it as well. And again, talks to that point you were mentioning about how it was one of the forums where people could put questions to our leaders.
Yeah, and I guess pointing to change as well. Twitter has changed. It's now X. It's had to decouple actually when all of that sort of happened from Q&A because they couldn't take that feed anymore because it was a bit too fast and loose.
Yeah.
So, and of course they didn't want to endorse a platform that they thought wasn't taking good steps around fact-checking and all of that sort of stuff. So, yeah, the world has changed significantly, of course. What comes next is really the big question.
Yeah.
ABC, Hugh Marks, the new boss there, he's only been in that job a few weeks. This is coming with some redundancies, but what's replacing it? He wasn't going to point to anything specific quite yet.
No, but he did say, and this quote really interested me, I know we're looking to bring back one very famous format from some years ago that I won't announce today. And I'm racking my brains trying to think of what that is. Enough Rope, the Andrew Denton interview show, is the only thing that I could really think of that would sort of fit that bill. That was a hugely popular show and it wouldn't cost that much.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. We do know what Channel 10, though, is replacing the project with. It's going to be a bigger news program. They're talking about more comprehensive analysis, trusted reporting, longer form investigative journalism. They've amassed a bit of a team with a few names I recognise. So, yeah, it looks like they're charging ahead.
And I'm really interested in that just from someone who consumes a lot of news and is interested in the business of news because it seems like they're moving sort of more towards a traditional format, or what I would think of as a traditional format of news, investigative journalism and long form content, when that's not necessarily the direction that the project was heading in. So they seem to have kind of gone backwards in a way rather than forwards. But it'll be interesting to see if it works out and if it rates.
Andrew, as they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. message now from Aware Super, which has just made retirement even more affordable by lowering admin fees by up to 25% for their retired members. With the cost of living front of mind for many Aussies, Aware Super is committed to keeping costs lower and delivering the benefits of being one of Australia's largest super funds. So with more of their members' money staying invested and working hard, your retirement savings are in good hands if you're with Aware Super. With lower retirement admin fees, Aware Super is super helpful. Consider if Aware Super is right for you and the PDS and TDM at aware.com.au. Amount of fee reduction will vary based on the amount balance. Issued by Aware Super Proprietary Limited, trustee of Aware Super.
Let's look at what's coming up, Claire. A couple of things on today. First, the Prime Minister is heading to North America for a couple of meetings before the G7, and it's Donald Trump's 79th birthday today. Think there'll be a big party?
I reckon there'll be a round of golf.
Yeah.
If I was going to pick.
Yeah, play the percentages.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Yeah.
The other thing on today, the Trooping of the Colour at Buckingham Palace. It's the official celebration of the King's birthday.
Not his actual birthday, though, right? I'm not great on royal stuff.
On royal things.
On royal things.
No.
His real birthday is the 14th of November.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
But there will be plenty of pomp and pageantry. I know that about the royals.
Yep.
Marching soldiers, horses, the balcony wave, of course.
Come Monday, our time, G7, that meeting kicks off officially with the leaders in Alberta in Canada. Top of the agenda, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, trade, tariffs, lots to talk about, of course.
So much to talk about. Leaders of the G7 countries will be there. They are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States. Other countries are also invited to attend. Australia is not a G7 country, not a member, but as other leaders head there to catch up with their counterparts while they're in one spot, Albanese is hoping to meet Trump to discuss, well, what won't they talk about? Tariffs, defence, Israel, as you said, so much.
Yeah, so AUKUS, of course, we mentioned that before that review that the United States has just kicked off. So it's kind of good timing, to be honest, to get in front of him if he's able to swing that. But this week we've also joined the UK, Canada, Norway and New Zealand in imposing sanctions on a couple of Israel's cabinet members. The claim is that they've incited violence against Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank. The United States was not happy with that move at all. Whether it's linked or not, there is no confirmed meeting between Trump and Albanese at this stage anyway.
No, and then to move forward to Wednesday, State of Origin Game 2 kicks off at 8 o'clock Australian Eastern Time. You can watch that on Channel 9 if you're interested. It's a must-win for Queensland after Game 1. They had a pretty bad loss against the Blues, didn't score many points in that game, so they've got a fair bit of work to do, and it's a new era for them as well. So the team's long-time halfback and captain, Daly Cherry Evans, one of those rugby league names that even people who don't follow rugby league might know or
like
would have heard of.
Yep.
He was dropped this week after Game 1 for Game 2. He's been captain since 2019, I think, but he's 36, so getting on a bit in sporting years, and he's been replaced by Tom Dearden, who is in his early 20s.
I wasn't going to fight you for explaining that, so thank you very much. Also on Wednesday, Treasurer Jim Chalmers, he goes to the National Press Club in Canberra. What he's talking about is the second-term economic agenda. It seems like the Prime Minister has really sort of cleared the way for him to give a few more details on that. We should note too, Susan Lee is heading to the press club week after.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of speeches with sort of scene setting happening at the moment. Thursday, back to next week, Thursday, the Western Australian budget is on. You're a Perthite.
Yes, as the
a
Perth
personality,
expert.
maybe?
Oh no, that's like that's one of those words that people use outside WA, and if you use it inside WA, you're passed out.
I reckon you're a personality.
Don't you dare. And then wrapping up the week, Friday is Matariki, which is the beginning of the Maori New Year. It's also Take Your Dog to Work Day. I don't know who comes up with these days, but sometimes I'm glad they do. You don't really need an excuse to bring Tucker to work, though. He pops in quite a lot.
He does pop in from time to time. You can bring your hound too.
How do you reckon they'd get on, Tucker and
Fine.
Fia? Both pretty placid.
Tucker thinks he's a person, so he doesn't.
So
other
does
dogs
Fia,
are fine.
They'd
Whatever.
probably just jump in, do a bit of the newsletter, help out.
Exactly. On to Squeeze recommends. I've already given you mine. Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. You've got a show.
Yes, I will tell anyone who will listen for more than 2 minutes that I'm a huge fan of the author Jane Harper, the Australian author who wrote...
I think it was one of the first things you said to me.
Yeah, who wrote The Try. See, it's proof. And her fourth book, The Survivors, which she published in 2020, it has a TV adaptation on Netflix now, and it's last I looked this morning, it was the number 2 show.
It is coming up a lot in my Netflix algorithm.
On the platform. It's a great book. I'm only 1 episode in. I'm enjoying it so far, but the real recommendation comes from my partner, Anya, who has binged the whole thing and says that it is excellent. So you don't need to hear more than that.
Excellent. Well done, Anya. Thank you for that. We will crack on, I think. Squiz Press, Andrew, you've done 2 excellent interviews on our call sheet series here in the News Club show. Mm-hmm. This week you interviewed Hex. I'm not a gamer type person. No. You tell me and I believe you. Millions are. Yep. I think, as I've said to Kate, aspire to be a gamer when I retire. So that's something on my agenda. I really enjoyed this because clearly she's been through a lot and is part of this sort of community, and even looking at the social media that we've done on this episode. People love her. Yeah,
they love her. She's a remarkable person. She, as you said, she went through it, particularly in the early part of her career. She was a woman in a industry where there weren't a lot of visible women. Yep. And I know a lot of people have gone through that experience, and it is never pleasant. And it wasn't pleasant for her. So she got through that, and she's now a really great advocate for gaming and why she loves gaming. And I think even someone like you who doesn't know much about games, there's not only a lot that's interesting in it, but also hopefully a few things that if you've ever wanted to try it, a few things you can give a go.
It's what I've really connected with this call sheet series. It's sort of opening up of doors into real interests that people have. It's been really illuminating. So that's in the News Club show. You can listen to that now.
Yep.
What's coming out next week?
Next week we have Trent Dalton, author of Boy Swallows Universe, a very popular book and a very popular TV show. So he's talking to Bryce, so no doubt that'll be an excellent chat.
Yeah, like people love Jane Harper. People are obsessed with Trent
Dalton.
So that'll be really fascinating. I think that brings us to an end this week. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to pop in and cameo on the Weekly Wrap.
Oh, it's great. Have a great weekend. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week. A huge thanks to HubSpot for supporting today's episode. With their AI-powered customer platform, your marketing, sales and service teams can move faster, accomplish more and stress less.